start from the physical impacts that Professor Valentini just mentioned to address the questions that he raised about the size of adaptation versus mitigation, and how adaptation policies is linked and coordinated with mitigation policies. We know that the concentration level is really quite high, and the 2-degree target is really unlikely to be achieved. Riccardo mentioned that we are heading towards a 5 or a 6-degree scenario. I'm more optimistic. I'm more optimistic because I know that the recent technological development forthcoming that will lead to lower emission increases. This is what our model predicts, which is much lower than what Riccardo said, because we're not just extrapolating what's going on in the past. But even with this more optimistic and technological-based view of the future, the present situation with the Copenhagen commitments is leading to a 3.5 degree increase of temperature, which is really much above the 2-degree target that for many years has been presented as the main objective of policies around the world. So now we're heading towards a 3.5 degree, which is really too much to prevent changes from climate change, impacts from climate change. And these changes are really important. As Riccardo said, we are moving towards the top of all impacts that were expected in 2007 by IPCC, or even 2001 by the previous IPCC report. So previous IPCC reports have been too optimistic. We're really moving on the top of emissions, on the top of temperature changes, on the top of major impacts of climate change, both in terms of extremes, drought, flows, sea level rise, and so on, and in terms of other possible impacts on infrastructures, human lives, socio-economic system, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So the situation is really problematic. And the policy options that we can have to reduce the emissions to control climate change more generally are the well-known ones. On the one hand, we can control the flow of emissions. The second major option is to control the stock of emissions by letting emission reduction to increase in the short run, so by delaying emission reductions, but then affecting the stock of emission through negative emissions later, that is, through carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere later on in the future. And the third option is certainly adaptation to climate change. I don't have time to go deeply in the analysis of the three options, but it is clear from negotiation, from the recent COPs that mitigation is hard to achieve, and agreement on mitigation is really hard to achieve. And this slide shows you the reasons. First, large participation is difficult, and we need large participation in a climate agreement if mitigation wants to be effective. Otherwise it's not going to be effective, and it's just costly for the countries who are going to mitigate and not costly for those who free ride. So of course large participation is essential, and it's difficult to achieve. We need strong commitment in developing countries, and again this is not equitable, and therefore it's unlikely to be obtained. It's difficult because the problem is a global public good problem, and of course in this situation where future benefits are being uncertain and the present costs, even in the difficult economic situations, are quite certain, countries are quite reluctant to adopt measures to mitigate climate change. And there are a lot of technological lock-ins and party tendencies, in particular in fossil fuel-based societies, which implies again that mitigation is hard to achieve. So this is an option which is there, but not really to be achieved. The second option is delay emission reduction now and focus on the stock by carbon dioxide removal later. And again, there are several options. The main three options known today are land use and afforestation, bioenergy and CCS, and biomass and biochar. But the size which would be needed the size of carbon dioxide removal that would be needed is not really enough, or is not really likely to occur if you want really to control climate change. And to just give you a figure, this is the amount of land that we project with our model, the amount of land that we would need in order to control climate change through carbon dioxide removal later on in the future through bioenergy land use. And again, the size is too huge, because we would need 1,000 million hectares of land devoted to bioenergy. bioenergy, whereas today the total arable cropland is about 1,500 million hectares. You see, it's really unlikely to achieve this size of land used for bioenergy that would help reducing the stock of emissions if the total size is just 1,500 million hectares. So again, this is quite unlikely. It's promising as a technology, but the size of the investment is really unlikely. Okay, so we're left with a third option, which is adaptation. Adaptation has some benefits, of course, in terms of governance. It's local, it's not global, so there is less international connection necessary, even though there is some need for international connection even in the case of adaptation. Of course, there are no or less tributary incentives. It would focus more on developing countries that are more vulnerable, and so on and so forth. So there are some benefits from adaptation in terms of practical operational implementation of this kind of policy. But of course, it's important again to check whether the resources are sufficient, the distribution of these resources is equitable, and so on and so forth. And this is what I'm going to do in the next minute. Next, please. So this is what we came out with a model. On the one hand, even in the presence of aggressive mitigation, adaptation is still needed. So even in the case optimal mitigation is implemented, is still needed. And what you see here is the amount of residual damages. If we adopt adaptation and mitigation all independently, the amount of residual damages, the red line and the yellow line, is more or less the same. But if we adopt jointly mitigation and adaptation strategy in a sort of optimal cost-benefit way, this is a kind of cost-benefit analysis, then the green line shows that the total amount of residual damage will be much lower. So the optimal solution is a combination of both mitigation and adaptation rather than moving on mitigation only or on adaptation only. Next, please. Where adaptation? Again, most of the adaptation should be concentrated in developing countries. That doesn't mean that adaptation should not be carried out in developed countries, and the minister before was quite clear. Even in developing in advanced countries, we need to focus more and more on adaptation investments. However, in terms of size, again, in terms of size, most of the investments should be carried out in developing countries. And as you see, even later on in the future, even in 2050, when the damages from climate change will be quite relevant in developed countries as well, most of the investment should be carried out in developing countries. Next, please. These are some estimates of adaptation costs, estimates coming from the international organization mostly, or research organization, from the World Bank to the UNDP to the European Commission, FCC. And you see that in the short term, investments in adaptation are estimated to be about $50 billion per year. In a more longer term, the size is larger. In 2030, the size is between $60 and $80 billion per year. Next, please. But the investments should concentrate again mostly in East Asia countries, in Latin American countries, and in African countries, and more on infrastructures and coastal zones and water supply. Ricardo mentioned the importance of water supply and flood production issue, but these are the three major sectors where investments should be concentrated. Next. More recently, these estimates have been revised upwards because we have more information about the impact of climate change, so we're not talking about 50, not talking about $80 billion per year, but probably what we need is something about $100, $140 billion per year if we take into account also impacts on ecosystems, impacts on human health, and so on and so forth. These are quite important, so not only on infrastructure, but also on ecosystems. And with Peter and the European Investment Bank, we've been working on impacts of climate change on ecosystems to evaluate the kind of investment adaptation that have to be carried out. And again, the size of investment is larger than previously predicted by other studies. Next. Of course, the size of adaptation investments depend on mitigation. If mitigation is so weak, like the Copenhagen Accord predicts, then of course the size of investment is going to be larger and larger, and in 2100 there will be a booming of adaptation costs and adaptation investments. Next, whereas if mitigation is aggressive, that is, we are able to achieve something around the 2.5 degree target, mitigation halves adaptation costs. We will need much less adaptation than in the other case, so the size of adaptation will be halved. But still, even in this case, the size of adaptation investment will be quite large and mostly concentrated in developing countries, about 80% in developing countries and 20% in developed countries. Next. There is an equity issue, as I said. There is an equity issue because developing countries may not have the resources to carry out these investments, and also developed countries need to help developing countries in carry out these investments, because the benefit in terms of global economic development is going to be a global benefit, and not just a benefit for countries carrying out this investment, not just for countries, for developing countries. So we've been trying to estimate the size of the transfers that will be necessary, and in terms of total amount of resources, developing countries altogether should transfer about $180 billion per year to developing countries at the end of this, over the time period. But this would amount to only 0.2% of developing country GDP. So it's not really a huge amount of money. It's something which is in line with development aid, investments, and other kind of help that aid that developed countries are undertaking in favor of developing countries. But there is an additionality issue. So it's not a big size of transfer for adaptation. It's going to be beneficial to all countries, not just developing countries, but we need to discuss about the additionality issue, which is certainly something that from a policy viewpoint remains quite relevant. Next. What about financing? What are the resources? If this is the size that we need, as you saw, we are moving to the present estimates, 40, 50, to middle range estimates 80, to the most recent revised upward estimates that were 140. Our own estimates are even higher, probably around $180 billion per year. Where do these resources come from? We're quite far away from this kind of size of investments, because in 2011, the total amount of adaptation investment, approved adaptation investment, was about only 1 billion. So 1 billion is not really enough. The Cancun Adaptation Framework proposes additional 30 billion per year, still far from the 180 billion that would be necessary in the longer term to adapt to climate change. But still there is time, of course, there is time to achieve the objective, but we need to mobilize quite a large amount of resources to adapt to climate change. And what the Italian minister said before is a first step, because if Italy only is going to provide about 3 billion per year, this step forward can be achieved. What we need to discuss is the role of both the private and public sector in providing the resources for adaptation. And adaptation is composed by many different investments, larger infrastructure, but also smaller investments. And we need to mobilize different kind of tools, both important and huge public resources, but also a lot of private resources, including small projects in the field of insurance, in the field of microfinance, which are probably very promising, at least in the short term, until larger resources coming from the public sector are going to be available. As the conclusions, as I just said, start from the recognition that there is no way to avoid adaptation investment. We need to think about these adaptation investment, and we need to identify the size of the investment and the funding of this investment as soon as possible, as part of a comprehensive climate policy strategy that includes mitigation, includes adaptation. I've shown that the combination of the two is really optimal and provide more benefits in terms of welfare than adaptation only or mitigation only. We need both, but still we need to find solutions to fund both strategies as soon as possible. Let me stop here. Thank you for your attention, and let's move to the next speakers.